Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about a famous phrase uttered by Stanley Baldwin to the British Parliament during a speech in 1932, speaking on the advancement of military technology, and aerial technology in particular. Baldwin would state, and I'll extend the quote, "In the next war you will find any town within reach of an aerodrome can be bombed within the first 5 minutes of war to an extent inconceivable in the last war, and the question is this: whose morale will be shattered quickest by that preliminary bombing?" I think it is well also for the man in the street to realize that there is no power on Earth that can protect him from being bombed. Whatever people may tell him, the bomber will always get through. The statement was to say that as they stood, bombers couldn't really be stopped. They didn't have the defenses necessary to stop them, and no one really did, and sudden spurts of mass casualties early on in the war should be expected in the next war. While this statement would be a bit ridiculed later on, as unescorted bombers would have a horrible time attacking enemy cities, which necessitated the designing of escort fighters, a good deal of his speech was actually pretty accurate. Just in the statement that I read, both Allied and Axis powers engaged in the bombing of civilian targets to destroy morale. Later in the speech, he effectively predicted weapons like the atomic bomb, stating that will make bombs the size of a walnut and as powerful as large dimension bombs. The atomic bombs weren't exactly small by any stretch, but for how powerful they were, taking out entire cities with one bomb, the simile that he presented wasn't terribly far off. He would also touch on how the Geneva Conventions don't mean terribly much. They're good on paper and do set a list of rules, but in times of war, countries and entities will use whatever they so choose, and whatever they see as effective. Consequences be damned. Countries will use chemical warfare. Countries will attack civilians. Soldiers will kill medics and those surrendering. Realistically, the rules of war only truly bind those completely uninvolved. For those in the thick of the war, they mean little. Now, we could continue talking about the rules of war, but I want to go back to Baldwin's famous "the bomber will always get through" statement. This statement made a significant mark in how Britain elected to design aircraft and their aircraft tactics in the coming years. If the bomber will always get through, then that means they wouldn't have to really work on bomber escorts. But at the same time, if the bomber will always get through, this meant that enemy bombers would get through and attack British cities, and those cities would be able to do absolutely nothing about it. This would spur the Royal Air Force in the mid-1930s to call for some designated interceptors and bomber destroyers. While perhaps the bombers could get through against then more conventional fighters, against some new dedicated bomber destroyers, perhaps they could be stopped. From this line of thinking would come two real solutions initially. The first line of thought was to improve the forward armament on their normal fighters, which at that time generally just consisted of 2 machine guns. To take out the much larger bombers, ideally they would be outfit with anywhere from 4 at the low end to 8 or more on the high end. From this line of thought would come planes like the Supermarine Spitfire, with its early armament of 8 303 machine guns. On the other line of thinking would be the so-called turret fighter. This kind of plane would generally forego having a traditional forward armament, and instead, behind the pilot, would be a separate turret that was armed with 4 303 machine guns. In this configuration, the turret would have just about 360-degree movement, and it would be able to fire nearly vertically. This would give these fighters a multitude more angles of attack, and it would ideally keep them more out of line of enemy bomber defensive guns, not having to attack them head-on. This general line of thought would lead to several designated turret fighters. One of them is our subject for today. and it was probably the best of the bunch. This is the Boulton Paul Defiant. In response to the ever-growing desire for a new interceptor design, the Royal Air Ministry would issue specification F935 in early 1935. The requirements were basic: a two-seat day and night turret fighter that would have a top speed of 290 miles an hour at 15,000 feet. As it was to be a designated turret fighter, its armament was to be contained in said turret, and it was also to be a quote-unquote clean design that would perform just about on par with more conventional monoplane fighters. Other than these requirements, the rest of the design was largely left up to the discretion of the designer. To this request, multiple companies would submit their own designs, and these designs would generally follow one of two concepts. On one hand, you would have twin-engine turret fighters, as proposed by Armstrong Whitworth and Gloucester. These designs would have a pretty standard twin-engine layout, with the turret just sort of bulging out from the top of the fuselage, while not being very clean in that the turrets look like a slapped-on afterthought. This would give the gunner full 360-degree coverage, but this kind of turret would also lead to the most drag, and thus the greatest reduction in performance. The other general design, as proposed by Bristol, Fairey, Hawker, Supermarine, Vickers, and Boulton Paul, would be a single-engine monoplane, mostly standard in its overall design, and behind the cockpit would sit the turret, generally more nestled into the fuselage and the back end of the canopy. While this configuration would likely reduce the overall coverage of the turret, it being less effective firing forwards, the turret being more buried would make it more aerodynamic, and thus more likely to hit the required top speed. Of these designs, Armstrong Whitworth, Fairey, Hawker, and Boulton Paul would be selected to advance to the prototype construction phase. Supermarine and Vickers were advised to drop from the competition, to focus specifically on the Spitfire fighter and Warwick bomber, respectively, to which they obliged and dropped out. Then Bristol and Gloucester would be outright rejected, apparently rejected for their turret designs. While the Gloucester one appeared to use the same kind of turret as the Boulton Paul design, it being more exposed likely made it non-viable. On the Bristol design, they would actually have a remote-controlled turret, with the gunner sitting just behind the turret itself, so kind of redundant. I assume that this was rejected for being overly complex for no significant benefit. If the gunner was right behind the turret, then why wouldn't he just be on the turret? Then, by early 1937, the competition was reduced down to just two, Boulton Paul and Hawker. The Fairey design had been cancelled, and the Armstrong Whitworth design was simply not viable for that company. They were already working on two large multi-engine aircraft in the Whitley bomber and the four-engine unsigned civilian airliner, and they simply didn't have the time, resources, or manpower to produce another plane on top of this. Of the two remaining designs, the Boulton Paul P-82 would be the first to fly in August 1937, albeit without its turret, giving the prototype a rather sleek appearance. Its first flight would be rather short-lived, though, after an oil leak would develop in the engine. Still, in its short flight, it reportedly controlled rather well, giving it promise. Later that year, the P-82, now named the Defiant, would participate in another round of test flights where it flew for much longer, and some baseline performance was measured. Measuring in at 10.77 meters long, 11.99 meters wide, and 3.45 meters tall, with an empty estimated weight of just over 6,000 pounds, and still without the turret installed, but with some weight installed to simulate the turret, the Defiant would manage a top speed of 320 miles an hour. while outfitted with an early variant Rolls-Royce Merlin with 1,030 horsepower. Its handling was a little bit worse than what was anticipated, but overall the design was considered satisfactory. As a result, the Air Ministry would place an order for over 200 Defiants, in addition to another order of over 150 that was placed before the plane actually ever flew. A few months later, in early 1938, the Defiant would have its turret installed, but it wouldn't be until the end of that year that the performance tests with the turret were completed. But a few months after the turret was installed, on June 14, 1938, Hawker's design, known as the Hotspur, would take to the air. Unlike the Defiant, the Hawker Hotspur did sort of have a turret installed, but this in reality was just a wooden mock-up. It would still have the weight of the turret installed, and its overall performance was actually a bit more promising than the Defiant. With the mock turret adding drag, the Hotspur still managed a top speed of 316 miles an hour, and in it being a few hundred pounds lighter, it was easier to handle and control. In a vacuum, in a one-on-one comparison, the Hotspur was a bit better than the Defiant, and the winner of the competition between the two would be the Defiant. This selection had rather little to do with the comparative performance and had much more to do with the production capabilities of each company. While Boulton Paul would have rather little going on otherwise, and thus ample space from which to construct their Defiant, Hawker would be largely occupied with the Hawker Hurricane. Now, they did own the company Gloucester, but they too were occupied with the production of multiple Hawker aircraft. Thus, of the two potential designs here, only one of them was really ever realistic in the first place. Presumably, unless the Defiant performed horribly, it was almost guaranteed to win. Later in 1938, with the Defiant having already won the competition and effectively already being in production, the prototype would take to the air for performance tests with its turret. Owing to the increase in drag, the top speed would drop from 320 miles an hour down to 303. Not necessarily a terrible top speed, but compared to more conventional aircraft designs like the Hurricane and the Spitfire, its performance at this time was inferior. The early Hurricane was about 20 miles an hour faster, and the first Spitfire prototype was about 40 miles an hour faster. This is also including the fact that the turret gunner had some pneumatically operated fairings at his disposal that could make the turret more aerodynamic when not in use. Even when these fairings were engaged, the Defiant was still 20 to 40 miles an hour slower than more traditional planes. Regardless, though, as the Defiant was the winner of its competition, it would proceed forward with production. By July 1939, the first official production model Defiant would roll off the assembly line, ready to be tested, and by December that same year, the first 3 Defiants were delivered to Squadron Number 264, a unit that was reformed a few months prior specifically for the Defiant. Once they received their first aircraft, the first few months with them would be used in tactical training and testing. One of the initial major focuses would be in formation training. This aspect was viewed as key to the turret fighter concept. Ideally, the Defiants would fly in relatively rigid formations below and around their targets, and each would fire in relative unison at all sides of the bomber, quickly taking it down. Not only would this allow the relatively small caliber 303 machine guns in the turret to do great collective damage, but it would also strain the available defensive guns on the enemy bombers, not having a clear singular target to take out. They would also train in crossover strafing attacks that saw them fly across the nose of an enemy plane from either side, firing as they passed by. Past this training, then came an inevitable question. What if there were enemy fighters around? While they would expect that enemy bombers would be mostly unescorted, the whole bomber will always get through thing, there was the very real possibility that enemy fighters would be present. So, as a simulation, going up against a Spitfire to mimic going up against a German Bf-109, a Defiant would engage in a mock dogfight, testing its performance in one-on-one combat. In their tests, they found that the Defiant was actually able to perform quite well, and in fact, the turret gave the Defiant a small advantage. The gunner could independently aim and fire at the attacking plane. So as the two planes were turning, the attacking Spitfire trying to get in line with the Defiant's gunner could just keep shooting. Thus, in theory, the Defiant could defend itself in one-on-one combat quite well, by continually turning and just letting the gunner work his magic. Still though, some in the Air Force would speculate that once enemy pilots figured out that the Defiant was strongest from the rear, then they would no longer be able to sufficiently defend themselves. But still, on May 12, 1940, the Defiant would embark on its first combat mission. 6 of them, alongside 6 Spitfires, were tasked with flying from Norwich over to the North Sea along the coast of the Netherlands, where German level and dive bombers were expected to be attacking British or Dutch naval vessels. In its first live action, the group of 12 planes spotted an enemy Ju-88 attacking a ship, and they would spring into action. Both aircraft would attack the Ju-88, with the Spitfires falling in behind the 88 and the Defiants crossing in front of it, firing as they passed. This multifaceted attack worked beautifully, and the enemy 88 caught fire and went tumbling back down to Earth. After this, an enemy HE-111 was spotted as well, and with the exact same tactic, the 111 too would burst into flames and fell to the Earth. Then the squadron of 12 planes would return home, and the Defiant's first combat mission was a rousing success, 2 down planes for no losses of their own. The next day, a similar formation of 12 planes would embark on the exact same mission, patrolling the same waters they had just had success in. Instead of the larger twin-engine bombers, they would instead encounter a group of Ju-87 Stukas and some Bf-109 fighters. In this situation, the mock training against the Bf-109 could be put into action, and they could actually see if the Defiant would be able to hold its own. While the Defiants and Spitfires would manage to destroy 4 enemy Stukas, the Bf-109s proved to be too much for the Defiants, as there were actually over 20 Bf-109s against the just 12 British planes, and the Spitfires would offer little support against such odds. 5 of the participating 6 Defiants would be lost, specifically to frontal attacks. Now, technically, the Defiant could fire forward with all 4 of its guns, so why was it so weak from frontal attacks? Why couldn't it defend itself? Well, it's because the turret was more buried, and the canopy was in the way. When they weren't in attack mode, the turret guns could sort of sit on either side of the canopy, 2 on each side. When it would move from here into attack mode, the guns had to be finagled around the canopy, first pointing up so that the lower guns could clear over it. Once clear, the turret probably had 320 degrees of movement maybe to the rear and sides. If attacked from the front, there was this cone that the turret would not be able to reach unless the gunner then finagled the guns back over the canopy and lowered them down. Just far too much of a process for it to really be viable on such a short notice. Thus, without standard forward-firing guns, the Defiant had no realistic frontal cover. Still, though, the attacking German fighters would not yet be able to capitalize on this weakness, and during the British evacuation at Dunkirk in late May and early June, Squadron No. 264 would claim a whopping 57 kills with the Defiant, with 37 of them coming on a single day on May 29th. These kills would be fighter, bomber, and dive bomber alike, taking out HE-111s, BF-109s, BF-110s, Ju-87s, and Ju-88s. Allegedly, this was because enemy fighters mistook them for Hawker Hurricanes, and would fall in line behind them to attack, only to be blasted out of the sky by the turret. However, according to German records though, the losses were actually less than half what the British claimed. In return, in this time span, Britain would lose upwards of 14 Defiants. So despite claiming essentially on average 4 downed enemy planes for 1 lost of their own, there were some warning signs towards the end of their time over Dunkirk. On May 31st, at least 7 Defiants would be lost to attacking BF-109s. However, the Royal Air Ministry would largely chalk up these losses on the sun. It was a bright sun that day, and the gunners could not see the enemy planes flying with the sun directly behind them, which made the turret ineffective. While these losses were certainly concerning, the fact of the matter was that the Defiant was built solely to attack unescorted bombers, and hopefully it wouldn't be coming in contact with normal fighters. So these losses against these normal fighters were kind of understood by the Air Ministry, and the Defiant would continue to see daytime use for the time being. But then, on July 19, 1940, the Air Ministry would turn course and turn against the Defiant, after a major debacle that saw another unit that was outfitted with them lose nearly all of its aircraft. Squadron number 141 and their 9 Defiants were sent to take out attacking German BF-110s. However, when they arrived, they instead found BF-109s that would quickly swoop in and destroy 6 of them, attacking from the front, below, and the dead rear of the plane in a blind spot where the tail would obscure the gunner. After fleeing, one of the 3 remaining planes was written off as destroyed, and one of the remaining 2 now was in terrible condition. Effectively, the 141 had been knocked out in a single blow, which led to Squadron number 264 being grounded as a result to preserve them. Squadron number 264 would take to the air in defense of Britain the next month, but despite having some success against Ju-88s, BF-110s, and HE-111s, losses began to pile on, and within a few days, the 264th Squad had less than a handful of Defiants remaining. Clearly, it seemed like enemy fighters got used to seeing the Defiant. The initial shock value of them not being Hurricanes had worn off, and the BF-109s could use their superior speed and maneuverability to attack the Defiant where its guns couldn't aim. The vulnerability of the turret fighter with the increased drag resulting in poor performance that allowed enemy fighters to outperform them was very much clear. This would then relegate the Defiant to its other intended role as a night fighter, attacking largely unescorted bombers flying under the cover of darkness. With no enemy fighters in sight, even without the necessary radar technology initially, the Defiant would perform quite well, attacking enemy bombers from the front and below. Even with this success, though, by mid-war, the Defiant would effectively be pulled from active combat duty, relegated to training, target, and less combat-intensive roles. This was largely due to its armament of just 4 303 machine guns. By mid-war, Britain would have in much larger numbers better night fighters with stronger armament, often involving 20mm cannons. 4 303 machine guns, while solid with multiple other planes participating, was just too weak on its own, and planes with larger guns were much more effective. So the Defiant effectively petered out by mid-war, and the turret fighter concept as a whole generally followed suit. Now, the Defiant and similar planes like it are often listed as some of the worst planes of World War II, but is that truly accurate? Personally, I would not say so, specifically because they were designed with the intent that they would not be going against enemy fighters, In its intended role against bombers and larger aircraft, the Defiant and similar aircraft worked decently well. Outside of that, having to defend themselves against fighters, they didn't work all that well, but that wasn't their intent. I mean, can we blame the bomber for not matching up well against fighters? Or dive bombers for not matching up well against fighters? The Defiants and similar planes weren't bad per se, but rather they were very niche, and kind of also unnecessary, given that more traditional fighters could perform their role quite well. So they weren't bad, just that they weren't really needed. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. You know, I didn't realize last week, but my last video was actually my 100th video on the channel. It really doesn't feel like I've made that many of them. It's kind of like they all blur together into one amorphous blob. But think about it this way, if I average 20 minutes per video, that's over 33 hours of content, a full day plus 9 hours. That's insane. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this addition to that 33 hours, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.